Welcome back to another video drasha. This week's Torah portion is Va'era. This is the second portion in the book of Exodus, and we are going to get into the story of the 10 plagues in this portion. 7 of the 10 plagues take place in this week's portion, and then the last 3 will be in next week's. But I want to focus in on one expression in this week's Torah portion, which is not only a problem in terms of this portion, but it really is part of a big philosophical problem that we need to deal with. And the expression that I'm referring to is where it says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Now, if we remember what's happening, right? Moses and Aaron come to Pharaoh, let my people go. Pharaoh refuses, so a plague then comes. Pharaoh relents, but then it says that he hardened his heart, and he doesn't let them go, and now a second plague comes, and so on. Eventually, it's not only that Pharaoh hardens his own heart, but it says God hardened his heart. Now, the problem with this is that if we understand the expression, God hardened Pharaoh's heart, to mean that he didn't give him a choice. He made it impossible for him to change his mind and let the Jewish people go. Then we really have to ask ourselves the question, well, then can Pharaoh be held culpable for his actions? Indeed, this is, again, part of a much larger philosophical question, and that is the problem of free will and free choice. Because if we don't have free will, if we don't have free choice, we can't be held culpable for our actions. And for that matter, we also don't deserve any praise for the good things we do. Now, this philosophical dilemma has taken many forms over the centuries. There are certainly religions that have a belief in predestination, that really when one is born, everything is already laid out for you. There's nothing you can really do. It's all been prearranged. That's predestination. Now, in today's world, we have other forms of a very similar idea. There are those who would argue that one's genes really dictate what your life is going to be like, that who you are as a person is a consequence of the genes that you were born with. Again, that if one holds that kind of a view, then we really can't blame people for their offenses or praise them for their good deeds. Judaism has always taken the position that we do have free will. And you know, there's another form in which this argument has been hashed out, and that is in regard to the question of divine omniscience. If, for instance, if we say that God is all-knowing, so does that mean that God knows what I'm going to do before I do it? Well, if we say no to that, then you would say, well, then you don't believe that God is omniscient. But if I say yes, well, then again, we come to the same problem. If God knows what I'm going to do in advance, do I have free will? Do I have the ability to choose? Now, I can tell you this, without getting into all of the weeds of the philosophical discussions, I will tell you that the Jewish philosophers who have dealt with this question over the centuries have always attempted to resolve it in favor of free will. That is, they want to find some way to reconcile these two things. Yes, God is omniscient, but I still have free will. That has been I think the enduring position of Judaism. The fact of the matter is that the concept of free will, which is, again, essential to being able to hold people accountable for their deeds, is really one of the fundamentals of Judaism. There's another way in which we can look at this coercion as well. And I'm reminded of some people that I've known who grew up Orthodox in very Orthodox homes. And they've told me that, at some point in their life, for whatever reason, they became less observant or non-observant, whether it was temporary or not, whatever. But I've had more than one person tell me that the first time I turned a light on Shabbos, I waited for a few seconds to see if I would get struck by lightning. Now, when you think about it, again, if you have that kind of an internalized belief that if you do something to violate Shabbos, you could get hit by lightning, that's a pretty strong deterrent. Now, we could ask ourselves the question, why didn't God make the world like that? After all, we have all of these mitzvot. We have all of these commandments, things that we're supposed to do and things that we're not supposed to do. Well, if God wants these commandments to be observed, why not simply have a system where punishments come immediately and severely? If every time someone was about to speak Lashon Hara, they would get some tremendous stomach cramp and they would double over, they'd stop speaking Lashon Hara after a few times of experiencing this. If every time somebody was about to engage in some type of dishonest business practice and they got an electric shock that just knocked them off their chair, again, that would certainly change things. If God wants a world in which everyone is observing the mitzvot, it could have been achieved in that way. There'd be nobody speaking Lashon Hara. There'd be nobody dealing dishonestly. Everybody would be, very punctilious about every detail of Shabbos observance, if that's the way the world worked. So what's clear is that, number one, that's not the way the world works. And number two, clearly that's not the way God wanted the world to work. We see already in the story of Adam and Eve, God wants human beings to have free choice. And what we see is that when Adam and Eve were created, they're in the Garden of Eden, they're given one mitzvah, which they promptly transgress. So that this idea that we have free choice and then we can be held accountable for the choices that we make, that is built in to the Torah's understanding of what it means to be a human being. And God wants us to observe the mitzvot, but not because we're afraid of punishment or we're eager to get reward, but because it's what we should do. I will have to say this, Judaism does clearly believe, there are many, many statements in the tradition, we do believe that there is a reward and a punishment that comes for the observance or non-observance of the commandments. Whether the reward or punishment comes in this world or whether it comes in some afterlife, we see both of those ideas presented, and certainly that is an aspect of Judaism. But it says in Pirkei Avot, don't be like servants who serve the master in order to get a reward. Clearly, the ideal in Judaism is not that we should be observing these mitzvot because either we're afraid of punishment or we're desirous of getting a reward. We should be observing the mitzvot because we want to do the will of God, because we understand that it is the right thing to do, that it is better to observe the mitzvot, that's how we should live. That's why we should do it, not out of some coercion that comes from a fear of punishments. And so I think that brings us back then to our expression and to the question of Pharaoh. And that is, Pharaoh was under a tremendous amount of coercion after all, right? He's being told, let my people go. He refuses, and a plague comes that attacks Egypt. Again, after the first plague, the second plague, by the third plague, he should have realized, this is not working out too well, and he should have let the people go. Why didn't he? Now, if we want to say it's because God hardened his heart, then again, that means he didn't have free choice. But I think there's another way of looking at this expression. And we should note that the Hebrew word here doesn't really mean to harden, to make hard. It means to strengthen. And I think the way we should really translate this is to say that God strengthened Pharaoh's heart, meaning he gave him greater resolve to do what he wanted to do, because he was up against tremendous coercive power. After all, these plagues are attacking him and his country. He should have acted under that coercion, but he didn't. Why? Because God gave him the fortitude to be able to resist those and to be able to continue to act in accordance with his own choices. So I would argue that rather than being a statement against free will or free choice, I think this idea that God hardened, or better strengthened, Pharaoh's heart is really in support of the idea of free will and free choice. That even with the plagues, Pharaoh was able to choose, to decide whether to allow the Jewish people to go or not, because God gave him the fortitude to make those decisions despite the plagues. And I think that that really is the point. And so the lesson that we are to learn from this is, again, precisely the idea that we should observe the commandments. We should observe the mitzvot, not out of the coercive power that we're afraid of a punishment, or on the other hand, the coercive power because we're trying to get some reward. Rather, we should do it because it's the right thing to do. We should do it because we want to do the will of God, because we desire to do the will of God. And that, I think, is the lesson that we need to learn here. That Pharaoh ultimately was taught a lesson by all of these 10 plagues. And the 10 plagues were, the lesson was that God is in charge of the world, God is in charge of nature. The pharaohs believed that they were gods. And Pharaoh and Egypt and the Jewish people had to learn a lesson. No, there is one God in the universe who is in charge. And that was the lesson from the 10 plagues. But God wanted Pharaoh to learn that lesson by being able to use his free choice and his free will, not to simply have him act under the coercion of the punishments that were facing him. So I want to wish you a good Shabbos. I hope that when you have a chance to read the Torah portion over Shabbos, that maybe these ideas and thoughts will be of some, will help you to think through these ideas and to see really the lessons that one can learn from the Torah portion. Good Shabbos.